Hmm.
So that's what I'm putting here as a natural 3D, such as planet spheres, and data objects, such as cubes with X, Y, Z data. Just to remind, is that what you meant?
Yeah. Well, I mean, any 3D object really, but yes.
Cool. Jim is here. That's a good thing.
I'll go check if my 3D print is done and be back in a minute.
Okay, cool.
Good morning, Frode, and afternoon.
Yeah, afternoon and good morning to you. I'm just looking again at what Bob sent with that those theses. Had a
I've
look.
been I've been collecting them, trying to kind of keep everybody's comments straight because I think they're incredibly important. Um, Even though I too have reservations about the two papers he described, it seems to me that they're talking more about the SOD um, than they are about the topics they claim to be talking about. And that's not a bad thing in my mind because the process is very interesting. I, in fact, printed the whole things, both of them out so I could study them more carefully because I'm especially interested in the whole giga mapping idea.
Yeah, printing out is. I was with Dene yesterday in a bookshop, and we looked at how annoying it is that books tend to be of a specific size uniform, and how a thesis and academic papers tend to be A4 or letter size in America. And it seems to be a weirdly in between size. It's not good enough to hold in your hand to read like a novel. It's not big enough to put down on a paper on a desk to really review. So printing it out is such an important aspect we keep forgetting. At least I do.
Well, I have the opposite reaction. I print too much out. And my office is overloaded with papers, so I have an impossible time trying to control them. So I need a better filing system, or I need to focus more on filing. But I also realize that I individually, perhaps because of my architectural training or because of my architectural mindset, am visually triggered. So when I see a collection of papers uh, that are together, that triggers a whole bunch of thoughts, which is
Oh,
why in
sorry.
my office I have the papers.
Someone's at the door. I have to run. 1 second.
Okay,
Sorry. Hello?
Hallo?
Oh, hei, det er deg. Henning. Jeg kommer ned. Litt øyeblikk. You can probably still hear me, Jim.
yes, not a problem.
I'm going to mute myself. My brother bizarrely appeared. I'll be back in a few seconds, 1 minute or
I
something.
will finish my breakfast.
Okay.
Good morning, hello, hello. Bon appétit.
Frode excused himself for a minute or so because his brother came to the front door.
Ah, okay.
Okay. Cool.
I was downstairs to check because I did a small 3D print, with just like a mini disc, because I have a little screw on my phone. Sorry, I did not meant to blind you. Still new, so okay, yes. And I can make little accessories inside that hole, and then I can put the screw back. And what I will probably try to do is just to store it easy with a little stand, basically. I can put there or not. But yes, now I know that I do the minimum thing that just allows me to check the dimension, like the thickness and all, because usually that's the most annoying part. But now it fits, so I'll just have to actually find the right shape now. Getting there.
So does that mean you have a 3D printer downstairs?
Yes. A small one.
I'm jealous.
So to be honest with you, because it's just us, you should be jealous and also not so much, because it's amazing. Like you go prepare your coffee and you come back and you have like a physical object, but it's a lot of work, because indeed like right here, just finding the right dimension, and then once I've done this, it will be how does it resist or bend and whatnot. It's a real challenge. So conceptually, it's amazing, and it does work. But it's not like, oh, I have an idea and click, click, click. 5 minutes after, everything works perfectly. It's a bit
I was
tricky.
thinking
That's astounding.
when Jim said downstairs, I was thinking, so that's the next advance. We want hyperbolic storage rooms in our houses.
Actually,
Endless increase in space.
it's not to that point, but one thing I was discussing with the Fab Lab director in Paris is I don't know if you've seen this in pharmacies. They have shelves that move. They have like they're basically rotating like this, the shelves. So it's quite expensive, but yeah, ideally that's what you would have to want in your, or you would want to have in your lab. That all the stuff is reachable right there, but it moves wherever you don't need it. Maybe there is like little robotic arm that like prepare a batch that brings it there. But yeah, for now I physically go downstairs and then I pick the 3D print. But yeah, it's not. We'll get there. Ideally, I should have like a mini drone that picks it and bring it to me. Yeah,
Your body would atrophy.
Yes. Oh no. I found other ways to do it. In fact, yeah, one of the last 3D print I did last summer was for the front of my rollerblades, to like fix the top of it. So the two are not exclusive. you can still go around.
It's a really interesting point, and I'm so sorry. My brother showed up unexpectedly with his dog, so I had to show him where the coffee machine was. In traditional information design, one of my kind of ideas is information should be within eyes reach and tools within hands reach. In XR, that's not entirely correct because, you know, we have a laser pointer, and some of you know I'm not such a massive fan of that. On a traditional computer, we have trackpad or mouse, which is controlling a cursor, but it isn't connected. And I think one of the things we've really seen with Fabien's environment is if you do have your information within reach, it's so pleasant, you know, to move it around rather than to use a mechanism to do that. So that's interesting. And also the email that's been going around a little bit about, I'll put the direct PDF here. I'm not sure if everyone's seen it, but it's been a discussion around the layout of some specific master thesis where there's all kinds of things visually, which is fascinating. One of the last points that Ismail made is he really likes the idea of overlays. In a map, of course, you can, well, in some maps, you can choose what to see. I think that's a relatively obvious thing we've talked about before, but it's also something we haven't really discussed recently. And then when we talk about information overlays, especially in an XR environment, that could be maybe very rich. Fabien, it's only you and me here, no Dene, so we're gonna have to share hosting responsibility, which means no hands from you, please.
No hands. So one quick thing for 3D printing that I haven't explored much, but there is also the pen. And what's interesting is the pen has a little pressure sensor on the tip. And thus basically you can like sketch and you will have it as in 2D. But here you have the 3D coordinates. So you can do this. So I think in terms of, it's not super precise, but a little bit precise. But in terms of being able to interface with the real, if you have to do it in 3D, maybe that could help a lot, this kind of workflow. Yeah, to check. And while I was listening to you, Frode, I was thinking one of the interface that is arguably as pleasant as moving 3D cards in our current XOR environment, and that pretty much everybody here has, is magnet on the fridge. A lot of us like put like a little word, like what's happening tomorrow, or the schedule, or some of the events and whatnot. And I don't know, I like it. I find it pretty pleasant. It's kind of it's still spatial, but it's very, yeah, I don't know if it's intuitive or if we learn to use it, but I think that might be, I'd be curious to read a bit more actually on the topic. If people have, like, we could even have like photos of our fridges, but how do people use that central piece of the kitchen as kind of knowledge management? Nothing fancy that we have like in big, huge corporation, but still I think it works quite well.
The magnet on the fridge is an example of Frode's comment, information within eye's reach or hand's reach. Frode, that phrase that you mentioned causes me to repeat something that's been uppermost in my mind. The paper I wrote about formatting for the book 2 years ago or so, the key phrase is now that key ideas should be visually self-evident at a glance. That's the kind of, that's a short sentence that summarizes kind of what I've got on 4 pages now. But I'd also point out that the at a glance component of that is something that Bob Horn wrote about 30 years ago.
I'm going to give the mic to Mark in a second, but today we do have a little bit of an agenda, believe it or not, and I'll introduce that after Mark. I just wanted to say I love hearing the word at a glance. I was the first person to use the word glanceable on the web because I started using it with my research, and I did a search and it didn't exist, but this is in the early 90s, so it's not that much of a deal. But I love that notion of just, you don't have to spend too much time to figure out what something is. Thank you for bringing that up. And yes, I absolutely acknowledge Bob has done it just a few years earlier. Mark.
All right. So I'm sorry. Yeah, I was going to flip back to this point about the discussion that was going on in the email. And one of the things that I did think about, because I noticed that there was also mention of Nick Susanis's doctoral thesis dissertation, depending on which side of the Atlantic you are, which was basically done as a graphic novel comic, call it what you will, which was interesting. But this issue about surfacing stuff is, so no design is without opinion, and one of the issues is, well, who are you surfacing for? I thought it was quite interesting the thing was made, but I looked through it and I found it rather sparse, possibly for the reasons that people in the email chain had said, in that so all it really gave me were questions. It didn't give me any answers, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, it's interesting. I like the idea. So, and taking the point of overlays is yes, but it's about discoverability. I'm involved in a couple of papers at the moment, hypertext papers, which, well, I don't know if they'll go anywhere this year. But one of the things that is beginning to come to the fore is that it's all very well inventing these things, but does the man or woman on the top of the Clapham omnibus actually understand them? So it's all for naught if we make all this cleverness. We have overlays, we have this, that, and the other. But most of us are trained to actually be quite literal in our visual parsing of what's there. So it's fine to have these very nuanced things for the educated few who know what they're looking for. So what I see and what was raised there is that's fine. And I think back to when I used to write service briefings, I could write incredibly complicated things. I was writing for a very trained audience who were thinking on multiple axes all the time. I try and do that with some of my colleagues in the department, and they're just following the last thing I wrote. And yet they're twice as bright as the people I used to live with, and that's a real wake up to me that it's build it and they will come is rarely the case unless it's something very, very simple. So one of the things to bear in mind is that we can do all these things, but are they discoverable for people in a meaningful way? Because if they're not, they will walk away from it and not engage. Thanks.
I'll comment on Mark's comment, but Karl, please go ahead, and then Peter, and then we go on to a topic, believe it or not.
I was just going to tie in to the refrigerator magnet kind of glanceable things in that it's the difference between recognition and recall memory. And recognition memory is so much stronger of a trigger than recall is, that anything visually or audibly or any sensory input you have can propagate its way through your synapse channels to reach multiple different memories. Whereas if you're recalling, you're using one path. And so having stuff that is visible or touchable, reachable, whatever, that can trigger recognition memory allows you to chunk things a lot better. So you can have a lot higher information density without as much stuff immediately around. In addition, those kind of visual triggers are really, really important for certain types of neurodivergent people, mainly ADHD, because they have problems with object permanence and recall memory degradation. And having things that they can see or touch helps them to remember that certain things exist at all.
Thank you. Peter.
Okay, cycling back to the thesis design, I just want to mention that I'm really fond of Edward Tooft-inspired book layouts with very wide margins that contain categorized margin notes. Now, some examples I've built on this have incorporated little icons so that you can immediately tell what the note's going to be about without even looking at any of the text whatsoever. They can also be color-coded so that you could get a sense of a category. The icon could provide a separate dimension. So the icon could be what kind of a note it is. The color could represent a category for the note. Also, some designs have multiple streams of footnotes, which I really love and find useful because then I can only pay attention to the category of footnote that I'm interested in. The best is like when you factor out literature citations from substantive footnotes so that you're not conflating the two, and it just makes it a lot cleaner in the design and easier to be able to come in like a reference mode where I'm not necessarily reading the linear text, but I'm really focused on what's going to be in the margins based upon a pointer from the index in the back. And the index at the back is really, really important. I like to have indexes and I like to have concordances because the indexer isn't always going to be interested in the terms that I care about. Particularly if, say, I'm researching World's Fairs and I'm coming into a general historical text about the 1960s, the odds that World's Fair is going to be a term that's indexed are relatively low. But if I had a concordance available, I'd instantly be able to know whether I was going to find what I cared about in there without having to read through the period that overlapped the 1960s World's Fairs to figure out whether they surfaced in the main text of the discussion. So having all those different apparatuses available is really powerful because, again, they support both reading the text in a linear fashion when you're going through it and also using it in a random access fashion.
So in comments on all of that, first of all, briefly to you, Peter, as you probably know, in Reader, you can highlight based on what kind of thing it is, and they do have different colors. So, whether you come across something that is important or quotable, You can change the colors yourself, so you can build that over time. That is, completely agree with that. And in terms of recall and recognition memory, as in trying to remember something rather than recognizing something, that is why I believe the control click menu is amazing as an interface, because it gives you a clear way to find your opportunities, but you can also see what your quick actions are. Something like this we don't yet have in XR. I think it's one of the exciting things we can build on. And I wasn't planning on showing this today, but because of the last three comments, because now we have categorized this. So now we can choose to go to the view menu, and we can choose to see only, for instance, importance, or we can choose to see whatever based on what we did, right? So we can have, for instance, a list of all the highlights that are of something you think is quotable across a certain corpus of documents. So yeah, that was useful. So what we want to talk about today, Fabien and me, desperately, is the gesture thing, but from a very specific point of view. But actually, before I show the very brief notes we have, hi Tom. So we have this notion, we've been discussing a lot, all of us, about who the end user of this is, right? And probably the end user of this, theoretically, and don't forget, we're not making a product, this is research. It will be an awake, clever student who's curious, like Jesse, who's in our community, who will try something new. But we must not ignore the great wise people in our community either. But when we show it to them, we must say, this is for younger students. So that's the context. With that in mind, one way to design this so that we're happy at the end of the year is we have a notion of a wow view, right? Because Fabien and I had an interesting discussion last week where we had some really useful misunderstandings on what we kind of meant by that. Unless I'm wrong, Fabien, you thought I meant maybe some fancy graphics, Hollywood style. But what I really mean, and this is what Fabien has been pushing on forever, is an amazing interaction. I mean, I could imagine, like in a movie, you are in the environment, you raise your hand and you do a thing, and then something amazingly useful happens. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about glitters and unicorns flying about. We're talking about, my God, I do that and this happens in the space. So yeah, Fabien, on that, and then I'll go through the little lists.
Which indeed, you're right. It's I'm afraid of the super fancy sci-fi, super cool graphics because they're super cool, but also because when I did a couple of kind of hackathon where I tried to implement some of them, and they were just nonsensical. Like it just didn't make sense. Like you would go through like crazy hoops to do an action that looked very grandiose, but in practice, like you don't want to flail your arm like this. I mean, if you're at the gym, yes, but otherwise you don't want to do that. So when you actually try to do them, they look cool, but they're not that cool to actually do. So that was a big warning. So I'm glad we actually agree, understand each other there. Yeah, I mean, I'm not Tom Cruise, and none of us are. So, and I think again, when you actually try to do the thing, it is not cool. What is a little bit more problematic, though, I don't know if it's problematic. What I'm a little bit afraid of is kind of to go back to the fridge and the magnet, or let's say blackboard, whiteboard. Is some of the comments you made, Frode, last time when you tried the demo live. When you were moving the cards around, it's like, and it's something also that I saw in Paris with the last demo, where people were actually pretty excited by that. But I don't know how to say this. It comes from free with the space. Like you move those 3D objects in space. So how do we avoid getting stuck there? How do we just like the most minimal affordance of being able to bring a card in space and make it float is amazing, but it's not enough. So I'm not sure how we go beyond this. Neither like super flashy Tom Cruise indeed, nor like, okay, we move objects in space, they float, so what? Because in itself it is cool, but don't think it's enough.
Yeah. So I'm going to go through some quite boring bullet points. Because Bob Horn demands lists, and I'm very grateful for that. These are things that once we've discussed them, we will put on the website as some of the attributes of the world we're looking at. And Mark, also kind of looking at your comments there by wow. I don't know what that means at all, but the thing is, we've done a lot of work on the data, especially you, Mark, with the JSON and how we parse it, where it comes from, all of that. So you also said recently, let's just move things in space and see what happens. So at this point, I feel we should think about something that would be really impressive and see if it's feasible, right? And also if it's useful. It may not be useful, but right now we are doing a sales job. And I mean that very, very sincerely. We're trying to sell the notion of working in a headset because we believe that at some point, maybe in 5 years when the quality is better and they're cheaper and everything, it will be very feasible to do so. So it truly is that. If it turns out that we fail at that, that's also research. Anyway, right, okay. I'm just going to go through these few points and then we have discussion. So one of the things we talked about in the group is grounded gestures, and you don't need to read this. This is mostly listy, so I can tell you briefly. For instance, the thing of if you have your hand over an object, only around that object, if you do that motion, will the object get smaller. That's what we mean by grounded. Like in the real world, you got to touch the thing you're interacting with. Sorry, that's probably noisy. So that's part of it. There's also time-bound gestures, which can be very useful because that's what grammar is. You know, it's like, Fabien, can you grab the book behind you? Like, when I say, Fabien, can you wouldn't expect me to say any word in the world. There's a certain narrowing of options. Similarly to, let's say, for the sake of fun, this means open. Once you've done this, the expectation is that you choose what to open. You can't suddenly do something completely irrelevant. I mean, you can, but then you break that grammar and you're onto something new, just like when we speak and we halt and we get lost in our sentences, right? So the point is, we need to build at some point, we need to build some sort of gesture grammar. Do this with this and this way, right? In order to do that, we need to start looking at the kind of object types we have. No surprises here, even though we may modify the list and it may not be the most logical. We need to look at the object characteristics. And this is where it gets interesting because we may want to do stuff with something that is invisible, but it is in our space. How do we tell the system, act on this invisible object to bring it back? We don't necessarily want to have that kind of a context menu in space, or is that, you know, show hidden like we have on many software. There's the things about what is in our view and what is outside our view. The object characteristics is, of course, almost infinite. What we're looking at here is object characteristics that are relevant to the user, not the computer system, but to the person, right? Also specific things like, is it connected, size and scale, position, relative and absolute, general affordances. I mean, we've done a touch of listy stuff like this, but it wasn't that useful. Then we look, general affordances. Generally, you need to be able to move things, hide them, bring them back, expand, fold, so on. These lists need more, so if you have any ideas to add something, please write it down. And then there's, I don't have a great name for this, but the dimensions of data, right? For instance, to have a sortable list, if you're talking about a reference, there aren't that many dimensions you can sort along. You can sort along the publication dates, also alphabetically by title or author names. But a lot of the other things, such as place names, you can't really sort. I mean, you can do alphabetical sorting on everything. That's almost boring. But here you have the notion of a physical map you can put it on, right? There is the notion of incoming and outgoing connections. In other words, what are the potential things we want to reach in and interact with? So that goes down to the wow views. And I do mean just that moment when someone does something they didn't realize could be done, right? And to do that, we can start listing things like, obviously, put things on a timeline, relatively obvious. And then there's the surprise thing of the mural. A single flat image made huge is amazing, right? Maybe that can be with layers in a different way. That can be incredible. Of course, as we worked on citation flows, avatar meaning, you know, you have the pictures or something of your colleagues around the room, you can see them. And then you can have, yeah, how these views are presented is also important. Like, should they be on a flat list? Should they be in a cube with X, Y, Z, and so on? And then almost done with this, so we can start talking together. There's one of the kind of fun notions would be you come across a place name, and then you take it and you throw it onto the ground. And now suddenly you're standing on a map where all the place names are highlighted, right? Entirely feasible. But first of all, is it fun? Is there a nice gesture for it? And is it useful? Yeah, and then we, yeah, towards a gesture grammar, right? I'd like to say that Doug Engelbart had, with NLS, he had almost a full command grammar. Do this with this in this way at this time. We need to consider all of those things. And this is the end of the list, by the way. So for instance, the subject, how to actually indicate the subject is not super easy, because it could be the last thing you touch, the current thing you are touching, or it can be a category, all the references or all the pictures, and can be things that are hidden. It can be based on all kinds of things. It could be a general change the room lighting, which has nothing to do with the objects. And then the verb action is not just do this. We want to be able to, for many of them, finesse it, like do this as a timeline this long, for instance. And that's all I have. So now I'm wondering what you guys have in terms of your dream amazing views that you'd like to have invoked. By the way, Karl, I see your pyramid, and that's really cool. But I would say for right now, it's utterly irrelevant because we're having fun. So, you know, Fabien and me had 2 chats on this, and we are concerned about doing a really cool gesture for this. But then we do another thing, and it's a completely irrelevant gesture. That's a risk right now, and we have to organize that. But we also have to just be creative and fun. And if we have contradictions, maybe we can learn and make a grammar out of that. Fabien, please.
Yeah, to me, well, I think the graph is interesting. What I had in mind, or let's say what again to go back to the quick 3D printing there, it's the interface between one thing, the phone, and something else. I don't even know what it is. Here, like a kind of 3D printed Lego kind of thing, or Lego themselves. Namely, that once we do have a gesture, hand waving or whatnot, how do we make it? I don't know if scalability in that scale is that dimension, but how do we make it composable so that we don't do like one gesture and then another, like a sequence of gesture, but how do we make them composable together so that we can keep on doing things, and then we address either more complex topic, or we can reach more items, or ideally, I guess, both, like being able to do complex modification on a very, not just large amount of item, but on a very precise selection with it, a large set of item. I think that's kind of the thing we're looking for. And indeed, that's why the graph, I think it's still interesting, is it has to be learnable, because on the link also I put on Slack, like I love VI. I think it's an amazing text editor, but the learning curve is like that. Like if you don't get it, like there were jokes about people getting stuck in VI, they can't leave the thing. So it's super powerful, sure, but if you can't, like if it's actually people getting stuck in there, like can you imagine being stuck in a text editor like that? It's just nuts. But if you know how to use it, it's like somebody who knows the piano, and there is a level of mastery that actually expands your mind. So I think that's kind of like how do we navigate such a place where we can have that. And it's, yeah, to me, that's the challenge, not like a choreography of beautiful movement that make a wow demo on an aesthetic level, but something that through the grammar of those gestures expand the mind.
Yes, but, yes, and, yes, as well. I think today we need to try to ignore that. Because if we don't know the amazing results we want, the amazing views, I think it's really, really hard to build a language for them. So I agree with your concerns 100%, obviously, Fabien. But I think that if we just come up with the most amazing views now, let's say we just, as a group, decide on 3, and they kind of contradict each other, that can really help make the language for them, I think. Anyway, let's see how it goes. Peter and Mark.
Okay, I think that we could draw some ideas from the fourth programming language. I think it'd have a natural fit for our VR environment. I'm dropping a link to a book explaining the thread interpretive programming language concept. And also, I highly actually, let me see if I can grab the image. Hang on, let's see. Copy image. There was a graphic for the actual cover of that book that just blows my mind. It's something we might actually be able to do for real. There it is. That's a representation in 3D of how a fourth-like language might be depicted in a spatial environment. So, just some stuff to let percolate in the back of your heads and think about.
I would like you to think more about that, Peter. I would like you to think about what that actually should be. I guess you're talking about kind of logical flow represented as connected cubes, which is very, very close to what we're doing. But if you have a way to kind of a thought of how to switch into that from something, that would be really, really cool. And thank you. Also, guys, as I always say, if you want to write this down, even as a paragraph, and send it to me, it'll go on the bloody book, okay? This is really cool. Let's not lose it. Mark.
Okay, so in a yes, but about the sort of, well, let's just not think about things, but just dream anything up. One of the problems with that is most of the things mentioned actually turn out to be actually they just don't work. I mean, timelines are. I'll take one example that I think actually is sort of quite well trammeled. Is that it's still really hard to find a good sort of system that just takes stuff and puts it on a timeline. So no amount of wishing is, from my mind, after sort of probably pushing at this for about 30 years, going to suddenly make that. No matter how much we dream it, it ain't going to make it better. So there is a date. We have to keep the two things in balance. I'm not trying to say don't think of cool things, but just thinking up stuff smacks of a problem, a solution looking for a problem, and that's actually anti-wow in my mind. The thing that makes you go wow is okay, cool. Oh wow, yeah, that can happen. Glitzy stuff. So things suddenly appearing less so, because
Mark,
unless it's fairly close to what you know or understand, it's just stuff. It's, we're used to that. Any ad ever, promises the earth, you buy one and it's actually not so good. Okay. And I'm not trying to be snippy here, but there is a fundamental point here. So I don't think we should dream too far ahead of what we think is possible. I mean, if it's hard to do a timeline in 2D, do we suddenly think that it's actually going to get any easier in 3D?
Yes. Oh, that was rhetorical.
Okay, well, no. Well, good. Well, give us an example, but don't let's put some edge on it.
Okay.
I say that because we've been talking about a timeline,
Mark,
in this group for I think 4 years, if not longer. But I'm yet to see one. I produced lots of data for it, but nothing's ever been done with that. And I mean, I produce data because I know how to do that. I'm not a graphic designer. I'm not a thing. But I have spent a lot of time trying to use existing tools to make timelines.
Okay.
And one of the things I always understand from that is, depressingly, for all the work that goes in, they're actually remarkably not very good, which is a shame, because conceptually, at the dreaming level, we say, yeah, well, who wouldn't want this?
Okay. So, two separate things on that. Number one, I use ChatGPT for timelines for documents, and it's pretty damn good. I'm not saying it's perfect, but as an example, as the whole dreaming thing is concerned, as I come from an arts background, right? And we need to do exactly what you're saying, Mark, but not now, right? Now we need to just do some crazy stuff. And if we mark down timeline, brackets, nah, that's fine. But we shouldn't, it's kind of a brainstorming session, right? What do we really want? Peter has been a strong advocate of memory palaces, which is definitely a part of what we're looking at, right? So, but the idea here is really not just a thing like a timeline or a memory palace. What I'm really looking at here is, because let's call it advertising, let's call it theater, let's call it whatever we call it. But I'm really looking at the, so imagine Tim Berners-Lee, brilliant guy. Mark and I have both had the pleasure of working with him to a degree, right? Much more than the web. Let's take some iconic figure. So let's say he goes through the demo as we have it now, and he's all, yeah, this is very cool. And then, just for the sake of this discussion, we say at the very last room, we have a little bit of a surprise kind of thing for him. This is the room or experience or step or whatever. We say, okay, now you have this data in your hand. Now flip your hand over, do this with your fingers, whatever the cool gesture might be. And then suddenly something happens. It's like all the references suddenly turn into pictures of the authors connected on a timeline with Venus in the background. Whatever the heck it is, right? Not just graphically cool, but a thing that you just could not do easily with a click and control trackpad. But when you actually get to use your body to do it, and you have that change, that's the wow I'm talking about. The action and the results, not one alone. Fabien, I hope you're just going to say that you fully agree with everything I'm saying.
Absolutely not.
Oh, hang on. Mark just asked the question. Mark, this is just really briefly, Fabien. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I don't use Claude for this. What I'm doing is in Reader, there's the prompt that says timeline. So it sends it to ChatGPT, the full text, finds any sentences with time, and lists it as a timeline. It is just a list. You're shaking a lot. Are you okay?
I'm sorry, that's not what we've talked about as a timeline. That's pretty simple. And the thing that doesn't deal with is not all dates have the same semantics within the note. You might be picking out the date of a paper versus the date of an event.
Yes.
Having them in a list is fine if you want to know the list of dates, but that's actually not very difficult to do. There's no wow in there. So you can do that quite easily, just scanning through.
Mark, I'm not saying if there's any wow in there. It was just one of many things on that thing. But I'm saying that, and that is just a super simple thing right now. I agree with you, but it may be possible to put on with other things. So let's not get stuck on the timeline, so to speak. Okay, Fabien, sorry, Mark, just wanted to respond briefly.
So it's not that I disagree, it's more that I'm clearly not documenting the work properly because, for example, in terms of memory palace, I was briefly putting it in the chat, but I'm not saying it's it's a little bit like somebody would toss Lego at your face without any, or with a little bit of the manual on how to do it. At some point you need to put the bricks together yourself. And right now we have a way to upload a 3D model. So typically the memory palace way, a lot of times it's you design a kind of space, so the palace itself, and then you put objects that relate to the unstructured list you want to remember. That's typically the memory palace usage. You have a list that doesn't have a memorable hierarchy or structure that you can remember. And this, again, regardless of how we enjoy the method itself, uploading 3D model, like drag and drop on the page works. Typing text, that would be, for example, the information you want to remember, and putting those pieces in the right place can work also. Teleportation works. Scaling kind of does, but it's a bit tricky. So the object, you would have to do it outside of XOR, but a lot of those pieces, again, are there. It's not, I'm not saying it's easy to do. I'm just trying to highlight that through the different prototypes shown so far, it is definitely feasible. Like, yes. I want to argue, like 99% of the feature required if we want to like ship, quote unquote, a memory, quote unquote, palace product is there. So I'm not saying it's enough, but I think some of it, again, is kind of Lego blocks that one needs to assemble for their own usage. And eventually, again, I'm here in case like either it makes no sense or it's too complicated or even something that doesn't work. For sure, that's going to happen. I'm there for this. So I also invite people here and whoever will watch the video to like try to make it happen. The whole code is open source. Everything is available. Again, not saying it's clear, but imagine weird Lego blocks thrown at your face, or I mean, gentle manner, but that it's not like super hands guided. That you need to be the second part of the work based on your own use case. So yeah.
Yes, it is crucial that you build it yourself, absolutely. But let's have more fun, right? So imagine, because as Fabien, you say, you built a lot of this. Believe it or not, what we're talking about is, oh my God, that sounded like Trump. I didn't mean it like that. So let's imagine we're in the currently lost room where we just have citations on little cards, right? Simple thing. We asked, as we do now, the user to do a rough sort, the roughest spatial hypertext or whatever, put a few things. And then we say, okay, now do this with your hand, whatever gesture. Suddenly, all of that is slapped on a timeline based on that, just for the sake of that, right? It's like, oh, that was cool. And now do this other gesture, they come back. It's like, okay. Now, over here on the side, you have your annotations within this. So, when you do this gesture and suddenly pulling forward is all the interesting quotes they've done from that, because they'll have to do some of the work themselves, or we tell them some of this has been done before you, but please note you could have done so and so. Oh, that's really cool. And then once they have it in either in their own configuration, because it's really important to toggle, right? So how they have it in their configuration or in a timeline, just to have that as part of our conversation. And then we say, okay, if you grab in a certain way and then you pull out and drop, now you can see geographically where these papers were published. Not saying again that's useful, but I'm saying going through, doing a certain thing, and you're pulling this forward, you're pulling that. And of course, it is really, really important, as Fabien was saying, at least one of these has to be self-constructed. But one thing that I've thought about today, and this, Mark, goes a little to your point as well, is, of course, in Author, you can do a basic 2D map, right? Currently, it's exported in metadata as a glossary. But I'm considering exporting the relationship data as well. So I think one cool thing that could be done is if someone has a normal looking PDF, it isn't, but it's normal looking glossary, and we tell them, okay, just pull out the glossary text and let go. And suddenly it's a very large knowledge graph based on what the author did, right? I'm talking about there's so many different ways we can do this. Just that moment of, I used my hand and suddenly, what? That's the kind of thing I'm looking for. Peter.
Okay, Fabien, I'm wondering in the system, is it possible? Okay, let me describe a scenario. Let's say that I'm holding in my hand a transparent sheet of virtual glass roughly the size of a laptop screen, and I have a few of them, and they correspond to different filters. So one could be dissertations only, another one could be female authors, another one could be from the 1970s. And say I have these three virtual filter objects. If I line them up in front of one another and look through them at my list of citations, would it be possible for the system to know that between the citations and you, there are these three filters, and then use that to apply the filters to the citation list to change that's a thumbs up. Is that a good sign?
So it's a good sign in the sense that it's a good idea. I never heard of it before, but it makes sense. At least if I understood correctly, you have, let's say, transparent sheets with a filter, your whatever, like number of pages, or and then if you have a stack of paper on the other side of that filter, you only highlight or you show only those. So yes, like that's definitely feasible. It's not implemented, but it makes sense, and I think it could be indeed interesting to do. The way I see it is more like you would take a filter, so you have this but transparent, and actually right now, okay, let me try to be more pragmatic. Right now we have commands floating in space. So what you would do is pick one of such commands, and when you bring it close enough to your face and when you drop it, it adds it as a filter, basically, because of the same way you would have, I see, well, Peter, you do have glasses, so you would stick them on your virtual glasses, let's say, and maybe the HUD would augment to say, hey, you have those 1, 2, 3 filters on, and then you would be able to pick those filters away from the HUD to remove them from your let's say, virtual glasses that filter through those documents. What I would recommend is probably not to hide away the documents that don't match the filters, but probably highlight the one that do. But anyway, yes, either way, we haven't done it. I haven't done it, at least. It's feasible. That would be, yeah, a lot of the. It's kind of, sorry. I'm trying to think through the metaphor of the Lego boxes. There are some Lego blocks, for example, that would be easy to replace by others. So if I take this, if you're missing a big block and you have two small blocks that are roughly the same geometry, no problem. Now, if you talk about a block that would be like an engine to make the other blocks move, that's much harder, and thus that would have to be more handcrafted here, because we have the drag and drop of a thing on the wrist. Having a drag and drop of a thing on the head is not that far from it. So I think adapting it, yeah. And we have, as we discussed briefly with Frode before, is something that hasn't been showcased a lot, but the in view, out of view. So that's currently for a single object. So for example, here, if I have my e-ink in front of me, if I'm looking the other way, okay, I'll try to keep things in frame. It will do the arrow on the HUD that say, hey, it's over there. And if I'm looking at it, it hides the arrow. So it tries to always show you a kind of compass, virtual compass for 3D object. Here we have one, but we can imagine having a dozen of them for the different objects. And those would be kind of the equivalent of the output of the filter that would be dropped on the virtual glasses. So yeah, again, not all the pieces are super easy to be there, but I would say most of them are there. And it's definitely technically feasible, or he said when regretting it after. I don't see a major problem there, major roadblock.
I did actually talk about you earlier today, Peter, with Fabien briefly, and I said that I do expect Peter to say something really weird that we wouldn't understand the relevance of for quite a while. And unfortunately today we understand it immediately. But as a provocation, I think that is really, really fascinating what you're talking about, using things as filters for things. That's definitely a provocation. I would obviously like you to write that down as well, although of course this is generated. I see Tom's thing is like, what's the third dimension going to be used for? I mean, okay, so let's just move on. Let's say we've decided on something like what Peter's talking about, something like a timeline, whatever it might be, who cares? Move on. What are other views you could imagine are cool? Forget useful right now, just quite simply cool. Or useful if it has to be. We're talking about supporting basically a master's student, maybe a university student, right? They're going to go through all kinds of stuff. And in the future, they're going to need to show their work. It's not enough to hand in one paper because AI could have done that. So it's going to be important for them to have some kind of structure to this. So maybe part of the structure is part of the 3D. Tom?
Yeah, I mean, as I alluded to in the comments there, I mean, there's a lot of different things we could do with that dimension and that structure. One thing you can do with that third dimension is depth. You know, how do you see through the page? You know, how do you see into that third dimension? And generating connections between citations or having cubes of, you know, where we have explorations of different cubes of information, but then that links to another cube that's the next, you know, that's from that other paper. You know, kind of think of a paper as a you know, think of a cube as a paper, let's just, or a book or something like that, where all the ideas are plastered on the wall visually and you can connect them and you can kind of walk through that visual space. But when they then reference another set of ideas, you know, another book or another paper, that connects up to another cube. And that's another way you could use that third dimension to sort of leap from cube to cube. And you're just duplicating the effort there, but it would be great if you can, again, this is kind of stuff I'm working on, but automate those connections to where if there's a standard citation format, it automatically knows, oh, this is a citation, and therefore I need to go either create a fresh cube for something I don't have a lot of information on, and then somebody else can decorate that cube, or it's a citation to an existing cube, and then I know it's going to jump over to the cube that Frode created. You know, the thought.
Yeah, very good thought. I'm just writing myself a note. So one thing, Dene and me were at the Victoria and Albert yesterday, and one of the things that was really beautiful there was large pages, older books, large pages. I personally feel that A4 or letter size American, they're both really, to me personally, quite shit intermediary, like magazine sizes. You know, you want to have something like this in your hand, or you want to have something large on your desk, ideally, right? So even just being able to, from the cube or the PDF looking thing, to take images or pages and make them really large on the walls in your space, and flattening, yes. Even though it's 2D, to have it big in the space is very
Right.
relaxing for the mind. You know, when you walk around a physically curated exhibition and you can stand in front of a piece of information that's this large, that's really nice. But the other thing is, some of you know, I don't know how you made me think of that, Tom, but my tool Liquid allows you to select any text, do a keyboard shortcut, and you have all kinds of options what to do with it. I could imagine here you are reading something and you come across Bergen, Norway, so you select it, not just with a control menu, but some kind of really cool spatial thing, and then you choose to see it on a map. Sure, that's obvious, but also on a timeline. If there is something timeline related to it, right? But you keep, once you select it, maybe you even have a constellation of options around it. It's like, yes, this also exists here. This also has this behind it, right? So you can maybe even move it around like metal type to see the various aspects of it for different units of knowledge. Maybe you can choose when you're reading something to turn on some dimensionality where if something is repeated elsewhere, it becomes actually 3D deep. Maybe it starts stretching in things. Fabien, please take over. I'm glad you go on forever.
So I think one thing that should be quite easy to do is, assuming we do have, let's say, a low poly 3D model of the world, and then a timeline is whenever there is such an entity, knowledge object, whatever, that has the metadata, as long as both this cube or this globe rather, and this timeline, they are properly annotated, then to make the link visual, and then you can bookmark it. Like you have a virtual desk in front of you with all your stuff. Then on the side you have the globe. On the top of the globe you have a timeline. Whenever you touch or point or click to whatever of those data which has a geographical position and a timestamp, you make a link, and eventually, or like a line that draws from where where that object is and that position in there. That strikes me as not something too difficult. It's like your well-known coordinates, basically. So as long as they're properly annotated in the space, should be. I don't know if that's useful. I don't know if that's if something would like to have like a sphere or a globe next to their virtual workspace all the time. But I guess for people, yeah, I think it's really topic dependent. I want to say, like, yeah, if I work in computer science and I think about an algorithm, it has nothing to do with a sphere and nothing to do with timeline, probably noise to me. If I work in another domain, I don't know. But yeah, technically, this at least doesn't sound infeasible.
Karl, please go ahead. I just wanted to highlight Tom's, please click through, guys. Even if you can't read it right now, it's really beautifully illustrated.
I was just going to tie in along this concept. There's an object in Minecraft that you can pull from. It's a developer tool, but you can actually pull it into the main game with a command. It's called the debug stick. And what it allows you to do is while you're holding this stick in your hand, you can left click on a given block and it will change one of the metadata variables about that block. And if you right click on that block, the stick will actually cycle through the different modes or the different metadata entries. And so that you can modify a block in place without picking it up, touching it, or reorienting it. And some of those metadata entries on those blocks are not accessible or editable in other ways, except with commands.
That is the most Fabien thing I've heard in a while. I just clicked through on a link on that.
To jump back on this, then I think it might be something that Frode, especially you'd be interested in, that I think you find a lot of the information there to be noise for newcomers, namely the console and some of the commands. Maybe instead of either toggling them on and off and hiding them by default, which is what you prefer, not hiding them, which was what I prefer, because I have an affordance to them. Namely, I know what the console means. So it's very frustrating when there is like something doesn't work, but there is no console for me to be helped with. So maybe that could also be a way that there is an affordance that is more, or maybe like just because I 3D printed this, I have a little like a loop, I forgot the name, but a way to inspect basically visually, and then when I don't look through it, also to go back to the metaphor filters from Peter earlier, that if I look through this and that I optionally grab and move, then I see the wireframe of it to signify that it's been debug mode. And if I don't look through this, then I don't see it. Maybe having it as something not toggle on and off, but rather a debug mode with a virtually tangible tool. Maybe that would be a better affordance.
That is super cool to see it something like a virtual loop. Mark, go, because then I have the next question for all of you. What could be the most 3D thing we could possibly have? Mark, go.
I was thinking when Karl's speaking now. I mean, this is terribly familiar with me because I'm used to using a tool where effectively everything, including what you might think of as a note, isn't a card. It's actually just a big mess of data. And one of the biggest thing, again, one of the challenges, well, yes, it is a challenge over time, is teaching people trying to use tools for thought to stop thinking about the literality of the text they're seeing. A lot of people find it truly difficult to imagine anything they can't see. We said, but you just stored all those tags. And I said, yeah, but where are they? Because they're not on screen. And we've had this sort of discussion here in terms of, so in like the current demo is, we've talked about having literal sort of showing of the documents we brought into the space, but we haven't actually really explored that at all. We keep putting text labels on them, and then we talk about how the text labels get in the way. And so it does show this problem that we are more bound than we like to admit to the sort of textual nature of things. And the textual nature of the things, looping back to what Tom's just commented on, is the past weighing upon us. So the way that we are often pushed into what you might, if you had the choice, think is premature linearization. So you're forced to, because that's, if you have a very linear display tool or creation tool, then you have to linearize in order to use it. But that isn't what you wanted to do. So we call that narrative, and we play all sorts of linguistic tricks to deal with the multivalence of the story we're trying to tell, or the object we're trying to describe, within that very narrow linear column. One of the things that the XR ought to allow us to do is to move outside that. Stop thinking in terms of the title or the text or this paragraph. What does it mean? So the thing that it really means might be something that you might call metadata, but again, that's getting hung up in the difference. It's just the information. You know it. Your brain copes with it. We just get, I think, embarrassed. We over-venerate the past 100 years of literary of writing, printing tradition. And I don't mean that to be disparaging. I'm surrounded by books. I'm not about to stop losing them. But we aren't, if we're talking about dreaming, we're not dreaming big enough. We're fiddle-faddling around with sort of visual effects, whereas we should be thinking, okay, no, I want to actually interact with this information, with this knowledge, with this thing that I want to show to others or explain to myself. I'm actually unpacking it. We have most of those things there. But I'm not sure that at the moment we're looking at that. We're still really in the world of 2D visualization done in 3D, and I'm not sure that's actually moving things as much forward enough as we should. So thanks.
I agree with your concern, obviously. Now, if you comment on some of the recent things like linear, nonlinear, and skills and all of that stuff, we're talking about authoring here. Let's just remind ourselves on that, because we looked at some really cool presentations. To become someone like Scott McCloud and to do an amazing comic book thing obviously takes a lot of skill. Of course, now you can semi-cheat by using AI images to, roughly do what you're talking about. Fair enough. Or you could hire an illustrator. But to learn to get it perfectly, no, of course, Fabien, and that is what I agree with, just for the record. But the point is, one of the really great things about Fabien's notion of scaffolding is kind of related to themes, right, or skins. So if the metadata is there, it should be a lot easier for the author to present things in a way that looks really nice when reading it. Because we don't want to just produce, I know you all agree, we don't want to produce a really shit knowledge graph that's a mess. Of course not. When we're talking about nonlinear information, as Mark and Dave has written about, there's hypertext for thinking and there's hypertext for presentation. It ain't the same thing. Right? But having the right data behind it, if it is presented and created in a manner that suits the user, like somebody likes to tag pictures on Facebook, other people like to collect stamps, right? If it is in a process that is enjoyable, the metadata can evolve, and then it can be much more digestible, readable, presented. Because those images, those master theses that Bob sent us, we may not agree with all of it, but at least someone has spent the effort to doing it relatively consistently and nicely. So that is why I'm now talking about wow views. I'm almost saying that if we can help the author having, and I'm sorry that timeline is a good example, but because it's kind of known, and Mark, I agree with all your concerns about it, but let's going from timeline to this view, where if we can define a few things, because if we expect the author to manually place everything, every knowledge thing, it's going to be a pain if that is the only presentation. And again, preaching to the choir just for clarification here, but it should probably be one of the views. So I would love to hear more other views that you think could be semi-scaffolded, semi-themed, that the author can polish and finesse, so that when you get into the space of our demo to this user, we say you have this, and now you do this amazing gesture, quite simple and intuitive, suddenly have this other thing. And ideally, Tom, you should feel like it's three-dimensional. Ideally, Mark, you should be inside it. Ideally, not in front of it. So I'm going to give the mic back to Fabien, but if you have thoughts on that, even if they make no sense, but if it's something around that, it may help us get to the next stage.
It's a quick remark on the earlier question about like what are we going to use the third dimension for? I tend to dodge that question usually, because I think if we talk about what's the name, data visualization, I think actually it's not so sure that having a third dimension is useful, because sometimes you just obfuscate some of the content. You have problem with scale, like for example, when people do bar charts, and then we're not used to basically for comparison it's okay, but otherwise, like for quantity, it's not. So it's not so easy to say that. I think it was so obvious to say third dimension what it will be for, and and I think a lot of the time, to echo a bit what Mark said earlier, if we do this, we risk, to paraphrase again, make things that are a bit boring. Let's say we're not that interesting. So I think adding the third dimension to data visualization, I'm not saying not to do it, but I think we have the third dimension. It's more that we lose it when we go back onto the 2D screen of our phones, computers, and all that. Okay. I think it might be more interesting not to think of, because if we add another dimension to data viz, it could be also through colors and other properties. If it's just one dimension more, I want to say, based on how expensive, bulky, heavy, unsexy those headsets are, I don't really know if it's worth it. If it's though like moving in space and moving things in space, and again, I'm not going to pretend I know how, then I think it's more interesting.
Mark, do you mind if I jump in and hit Fabien over the head with a big kiss? Okay, good. Here's hitting you over the head with a big kiss. Right. One of the things we discussed last week was the notion of doing what you want, and then you do an act to modify that slightly, not just entirely, right? So you can imagine you put your citations everywhere, and then you do a thing. And now when you do an action, you have told the system, I now want to separate based on time. So let's say the older papers go further back than the newer papers, right? So that is using the third dimension at will. So it's not just a snap into something else, right? So it becomes useful because of a specific reason. I could actually imagine also you choose to do it by location, which might be really odd, but let's imagine you do that and all we have is citations. They suddenly become geographically distributed, which you may or may choose to have a map to see, maybe not. Maybe you just want to see, do these cluster in Asia or in Europe? Where are these papers from, for instance, right? But so that you can more arbitrarily, like an XY graph, where you kind of have the XY, you have at least one other dimension that you can say, this extra bit of metadata, utilize that now in a smooth manner. So in summary, what I'm saying, we don't have to use the third dimension all the time. It might be something that we choose to move into at will. Mark, thank you for letting me jump.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on something that you said earlier, which I think misunderstood the point I was making about sort of stepping away from the overstressing of the visual text, which is that I'm not suggesting that someone has to say where everything goes. The point is the information is there. If we are constructing this effectively, then the sort of systems we're talking about will know what to do with that. It absolutely isn't about, if I write a document, I've got to say, oh, if somebody wanted to do a 3D timeline of that, then I've got to explain where everything goes. No, it's understanding that the things I might want to do is I might say, these dates are just publication dates. Those dates are dates in the narrative. These names are names of authors. These other names are names of people in the book that I'm discussing. That's actually remarkably useful, because if you don't do that, then your visualization is a bag of worms, because you've got all this mixing of improper mixing of data, which wasn't your intent, but because you didn't explain to yourself, let alone to anyone using it, what you actually meant. So this is why things like, again, if you start geographically mapping stuff, it's kind of hard, because wait a minute, this paper was done by 4 people working in 4 continents. Where do we stick the pin? I mean, and I'm not trying to nitpick. It genuinely so in other words,
4 pins.
What I'm
pins as we want.
No, because then but then the article with 1 author gets 1 pin, and the article with 7 authors gets 7 pins. So it's actually now being privileged in the display.
You make them smaller,
which takes you back to, what did you think you were trying to do when you asked for the information? So these displays, certainly maps and timelines, are much more nuanced than people understand, which is why when you see really nice infographics, they're wonderful, but they're static, and they're that way for a reason, because someone has put an awful lot of work into actually sifting out all this craft. The challenge, because one of the things implicit in what we're talking about and doing XR stuff is we are, one of the things we're dreaming is, will I just take the information that's there and I get something that is not full of ambiguity and is not full of craft, because the information's in there? And I think it's a really good aspiration for us to have. I think it behooves us, though, to not over concentrate on the visualization and actually think about, in a sense, what that means for either the author or the person creating the environment, in order to allow these wow things to happen. Because yes, we want those, but they're a lot more complicated than just thinking that you might have a picture that a display that shows a timeline. It's so much more complicated.
Yeah, but Mark, we know it's complicated. And sorry, Karl, just briefly there. Mark, all of those things you talked about are dealable, right? Pins, is it by publication? Because in that case, ACM hypertext are all in New York, right? If it's not by location, if it is by author, then if one paper has 7 authors, there's nothing wrong with having 7 pins. But these are for discussion with the user for the system. Completely think it's very important that exactly what you're saying, the user should be able to know and specify how that should be dealt with. But I'm not trying to sell necessarily a map or a timeline. What I'm trying to sell here is discussions around all kinds of craziness. Because until you have a vast experience, Mark, which we're really, really grateful for. But at this point, I think we should try to be very, very naive and, you know, really just have a little bit of fun to see what falls out of it. So I share your concern, but in the space, ideally, the user should be able to make all these decisions. So, yeah. Karl.
I think because I worked on a lot of XR projects, sometimes people can get hung up in how do we translate this 2D paradigm into 3D or whatever? How do we visualize this in 3D? And sometimes there is some fruit to that, and there is a good way to visualize a thing in 3D, and sometimes there's not. And so the question is, you know, what am I doing with my third dimension? Why are we doing this in XR? Why are we doing this in first person mode? You can reroute that question. Instead of saying, how do I benefit from a third dimension when I'm viewing bar charts? You know, how do I make a bar chart 3D? What does a 3D bar chart look like? You can instead remember that when you have 3 coordinates instead of 2, you have 3 distinct 2 coordinate pairs now. You've got XY, you've got YZ, and you have ZX. And much like when you're working in a 3D modeling program, you have your perspective view with your free moving camera that you can freely rotate the 3D object that you're working on. You also typically have hotkeys that let you quick snap between a front view, a top view, and a side view. And so depending on what kind of 3D object you're working on, even if you think of just a cube, there can be information that is present on the object itself that is simply not visible from 2 of the other views, which can help you reduce clutter by only having the stuff on screen that you care about. If I'm only messing with the XY, view of this object, if I'm only messing with something on this face, I don't need to see or have the visual clutter from the other 2 dimensions. So rather than asking, how can I make a single bar chart be 3D and benefit that, you can say, what can I do with a third dimension? Can I display multiple bar charts and easily flip between them or hide them or present one on the XY and one on the XZ so that I can look between them? There's other things you can do with high dimensionality other than scaling a single unit of something into that higher dimensionality.
Pause for thought. Okay, Fabien. Thank you, Karl.
I was not building up the suspense. I was looking for a link that I'm putting back in the chat just to clarify that there are experiments to do data visualization in XR already. So I'm not saying it's not an interesting topic. I'm just highlighting that because of that past work, including some of the people that I've met there who worked with this researcher, we don't have to reinvent the whole wheel. We should check part of the wheel that will propel us forward or wherever we want to go. And a lot of that is also open source. It's also based on WebXR. Again, I'm not saying it's perfect or good enough or whatnot, just that a lot of those explorations are done. Some of it is also done networked, so you can discuss with somebody about the non-flattened out version, which I think is in this context is pretty important, because otherwise you're inside your actual view of the data set or its representation, whereas there you share that those visualization with somebody else in the virtual space. That's it. Thanks.
Oh, this is a great call. I'm so grateful for all of these perspectives, deep and superficial, me being more of the superficial person. There is a great app on the Vision Pro that is all these old globes. I absolutely love globes, but they have one amazing feature. You're suddenly inside the globe, which is reversed. And I thought that would be absolutely weird to look at, but no, you can actually look at the geography from the inside out. And it's, as I said, it's reversed. You can still read and everything makes sense. It's a very, very strange thing. But why don't we just, for fun, in our last, whatever, 13 minutes, think of this way. Let's imagine we have an academic paper that we are writing. We expect it'll have to be published as a normal thing in ACM or whatever. But for fun, we as authors want to present it in a myriad of ways, right? So one would be we want to make a mural type illustration of the concepts. We want to have a version that is lots of bolds and different size text for that kind of readability. And our reference section is not just what is normal, it also includes, by the way, Mark, you requested that author export notes in the reference section. That is now done. So, you know, you can do specific, you can actually spend days on the reference section if you want to add all kinds of metadata to everything you're citing. Everything you're citing, you can have quotes, you can have highlights, you can have whatever the heck you want. So when you present this paper, you know that the reader will be able to open it looking extremely normal as a default. And then through these cool interactions, they can choose the views that you have written. Let's think about it this way. This is only what the views you have chosen, right? So one of them will be a timeline that will be automatically created, and then Mark will come and help you make sure that it makes sense, right? This is really, really important. Having things being spread out algorithmically, so to speak, is a good start, but it shouldn't be the only way, right? Even if, let's say you have an extract of all the names in your paper, one of the things author did to me today is think that XYZ is a name. No, that is not a name. I should be able to tell it that, right? So whatever default views, including map, maybe, and you say, no, this city, yes, it's in my paper, but I don't want it on the map. What kind of really cool views would you guys like to have automatically have the system help you with? And then you finesse it, and then you put a colleague in a headset and say, oh, I'm so excited to show you this. By the way, do this to see it like this, and so on. Okay, Marcus says here, to show the paper in a myriad of ways, the content of the paper needs to support those views. Absolutely. Can't make a bar chart with no table of data. Absolutely, 100%, Mark. I'm thinking we design it backwards. We design the desire for how you want to show it, and then later on we'll look at, okay, in order to make that possible, what is the kind of data that should be in there, and how should we put it in? No question that that's crucial.
I really caution against the latter. I see a few smiles when I say that. It sounds the way to work, but it doesn't. I made the point deliberately that use some information that needs certain visualizations. Don't try and make something that shows everything. This is what most computer tools fall in the trap of. I'm going to show you everything, and people say, or they say, or worse, they say it hasn't got a such and such, and they they go on and they read the next tab. So so sometimes less is more. So if we have a subject that shows, one or two of these things and shows them well, that's probably something worth spending some time on, rather than actually doing something full short across. Let me finish a second. There is a point to make here. And the other thing I was going to say is it's really interesting that when Karl was talking about the extra dimension, I just at that point happened to click onto one of the links that Fabien had put up showing a number of bar charts. And it occurred to me, something I hadn't thought of before is that when Karl was talking about this extra dimension, actually, if you were to pivot your chart, in a sense, you could almost have a sort of like a non-Euclidean space. So I'm going to take this bar chart. It's still a bar chart, but depending on which face I look at it, I see a different cut through the data. That's kind of cool. Then again, it does require that the person using it has quite some understanding of the underlying data. And this is going to be a problem if you're talking about in the context of an academic paper, because at that point, most of the users may be grounded in the subject you're talking about, but the whole point of the paper is you're showing them something new. So I think that again, it's quite a challenge. It's a really interesting, really cool idea. I mean, I was going to noodle on that some more. Whether again it turns out to be something that's a really cool idea that's actually really, really hard to do in practice. And it turns out it might have better be done as an article in Illustrator is something to consider.
Mark, you have done many well thought out yes buts. And I'm not saying everything should be shown at once, right? All of your concerns are there. They are registered. We're at a phase in the design now. We're just thinking about, as authors, what kind of things would we like to be able to present, right? I don't think that that is so controversial. And yeah, it's just, it's like shutting down things a little bit too early, saying, yes, but this may not be this. We'll do that as well. Fabien.
Yeah, so it's something I mentioned a few times, but to me, I briefly also put like responsive on the web programming. It's responsive design is how your website works on your desktop, but also on your tablet or your phone, landscape, whatever, which is a huge pain. But because you share a website with somebody and they use it on the phone, you need to make it work, to make it responsive. So when you say, oh, it has to be how do we want this paper to be? To me, if there are multiple views for that paper, then it's responsive design. And it also would fit rather well with a traditional publication of papers, because usually you will have a presentation for it, like a talk about it. You will have maybe a poster session. You will have data to produce, maybe code to produce. So to me, that would be part of that flow, and that would make sense that you have like a way to experience the paper this way. What would be the closest, or to me, environment for this would be a sandbox environment, namely where I can play with the content of the paper to verify that it does make sense to run the paper if there is any code or mathematical equations to play with. So the sandbox environment to play with, and I'm inside the paper with the paper itself, of course, but a way to interact with it. That's what I would be looking for, in the hope to at least reproduce whatever the author is saying. I guess that would be the bare minimum, and eventually find something else, kind of like weird and hopefully interesting edge cases that wasn't necessarily explored yet.
So Fabien also posted here, responsive academic publishing, paper, poster, code, and so on. I think that's a really, really beautiful sentence, because one of the things we haven't thought about is how cool would it be? Academic conferences, there are poster sessions, right? Posters have to communicate in a very different way from a paper. They are, in a sense, more visual. How cool would it be if you could yourself make your paper into a poster as well? How cool could it be if you could make your paper into an icon as well? And by that, I mean, what do you want people to see when your paper is one of 200? Right? It may be a three-dimensional thing. It maybe have little sticky outy bits. That is a separate design from how to read the paper, right? How do you want people to read your paper in concert with a lot of other things? What kind of hooks do you want to provide for the kind of Peter mad filters, right? You may want to do something special for that, etc. So there are many stages. I mean, I really think it's great if we go crazy and think of ridiculous ideas, but I also think that really plain ones like an icon and a poster on the wall might also be very useful, because a poster is kind of an in-between an image and a mural, right? Even that's a special thing. You can't easily have that on a normal computer monitor. So that's why, oh yeah, I forgot to mention, so Dene is not here today. She's flying back to the United States. She's in the air at the moment. I will be in Asia, first China and then Japan, for the next 2 weeks. I will be able to make some morning sessions. Like I will probably be here for a design morning session on Wednesday, but not on Mondays. Fabien is hosting technical sessions for the next 2 Mondays, which should be very interesting. I look forward to the recordings. But yeah, as I said a million times, write down, send it in, please. We are very, very grateful that we're not only thinking what's in there. And also for those of you who have access to the Apple Vision Pro, of course, there's the Metallica concert. There's also now a baseball documentary, highly recommended. It's kind of interesting how they're doing it. And that's a sports thing. So there are things happening in a different way. And I think it's a little bit informative of what we're thinking around. Okay. We have a few minutes left. Peter, Fabien.
Okay, I was just thinking it might be interesting for XR applications if we had, say, poker chips with QR codes on them so that we could take a data object in the environment and bind it to the QR code on the poker chip, and then I could physically give that poker chip to Fabien, and when he put his headset on, it would scan the QR code on the poker chip, reach out over the network, and pull in the data object that I associated with the physical token.
Having markers is a very exciting thing. So thank you, Peter. That's also quite Superman in the ice cave, isn't it? So thank you.
Quick thing on this. So on WebXR, I think honestly in XR in general, you don't have access to the camera for privacy reason. It's basically the operating system that manages it for you. So being able to take screenshots of the virtual environment possibly, but outside of it, typically if you don't root the device, that's not possible. That being said, it's actually, Peter, luckily or not, something I tinker with specifically on Friday afternoon with Leon. And through ADB and through Termux on a non-rooted device, you can somehow get something going. It's honestly super convoluted. Like the normal user would never ever be able to do this, but it's not infeasible. That being said, it's kind of a segue to why I raised my head initially. For the 2 session next time on programming for the system, maybe I will use Peter's example, the question of how to have filters for information as a way to kind of kickstart a tutorial, like how to make filters and converters and whatnot. But that would just be a starting point. Namely, the whole point is if you people have ideas of things that are missing and would fit within the context of a filter or converter, and I will explain there a bit more what it is. Please don't hesitate. If it doesn't fit, that's still probably interesting, so don't worry about it. But I don't want to make like a theoretical workshop tutorial explanation. So if you have actual use case or suggestion, then I'll use those as a way to even if for me to do live programming so that people learn how it's done. So don't hesitate, please.
Yeah, thanks for that, Fabien. Also, Tom, you asked earlier about those links and things. In our record, we do have a full list of links from the chat every time. They're not all annotated, but they are there. And also, this brings up 3D printing, what you said, Peter. So anything can be used as an address, as long as it's relatively unique. One of the interesting ideas is, of course, to print out a paper in 3D, whatever that might be, because that shape, if interpreted as saying, hello, I'm an address, if there is something that matches it, I can be used. Fabien is holding up something.
Yeah, it's mostly for Jim and for other who were there at the beginning. So I did have the second iteration. I had initially just the ring that fit in there, and now I have, let's say, a way to protect my USB stick port against hacker, so they can't access it anymore. Totally pointless, but maybe not. But it does fit. It just to show also how iterative the process is. Will it be useful? I will probably transform it something else, like for example having holes for Lego, so that you can actually not print the whole thing yourself, but connect to another system to delegate that part. So yeah, just to show it's very much ongoing.
So thank you there, Mark, for putting up a link to MCPs, which is a weird future thing, very useful. And I think we are good for today. I think we've helped open up the discussion a bit to what we mean. It's easy to get really stressed about the 3D aspect, which may or may not be always the most important thing. I do think half of what is unique about XR is gestures, for good and bad. Gestures plus, of course, control systems like Bluetooth systems if we want. So I think we're getting somewhere. But if you can just dream about your ultimate way of presenting your work, I think that would really help. And that can include something as prosaic as pretending it's a 3D book, but you're standing behind it as an avatar reading from it. You know, all these things must be considered. Something will shine through that. And yeah, so I think that's it. I'm available, obviously, via email or whatever, wherever things are. And another thing is we're now going to be really inviting people for the book. We're not sure where the symposium is going to be this year. We're not sure if it's going to be in America. I mean, as you know, I'm quite vocal against certain political issues, and I have seen several reports of people being detained on landing in America, being arrested, spending weeks in jail, being deported. I don't want to go through that. And my social media profile does not preclude such a thing happening to me. So Dene, Fabien, and I are discussing this, taking it very seriously, the people from Germany and other places where this has happened to. So we love America. Well, speaking for myself, I absolutely love America, but currently it's a little difficult for who I am to be there. So ACM Hypertext is extremely unlikely that we will attend this year. However, there is some talk of something happening in London adjacent to that. I am not at liberty to say more because I don't know more, but that may be something useful to root our work in. And if it turns out we're not going to have it in America this year, we will have it in the Europe or something. So it's all up for grabs. Jim?
I would like to correct something you said, and it's what America was and is in principle, but is not this year because of the child in the White House.
Yeah, there are many discussions around that. And as a descendant of Vikings, it's very easy for me to stand on a pedestal and say Norway is such an advanced country at the moment. But countries go through all kinds of cycles. And, you know, it is our job to really spread love and care for as many as we can through our work. And I think we're doing that. See you later, Fabien.
Bye, Fabien.
You know, however we do that. And, you know, I studied at Syracuse. I lived in New York. I lived in California. You know, I believe it or not, I love the deep south of America. The culture there, so much of it is absolutely incredible. And some of our politicians over here, I don't agree with. I mean, Mark and I can, you know, butt our heads against the wall of some of the things that have come out from some of the people here recently. So anyway, it's just a reality. We have to choose where to be, but for the book, clearly, thankfully, it doesn't matter where people are. That's a good thing of books, right? Author anywhere. So please, if you have someone you think should be invited, whether you know them or not, please email me. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, there was just on this weird topic. So there was a Saturday Night Live sketch the other day where one of the jokes was someone is really kind because they adopted a child from China, as though China is a third world country. China is basically 50 years ahead of all of us. You know, it is in many ways, of course, politically there are lots of complications. I'm not oversimplifying, but hopefully we can get to a point where we all learn about all the different ways of doing stuff. Was there a tariff on that child? Yeah, it's not so great at the moment in a lot of places for a lot of things.
I am still hopeful for the backlash because I think it's coming. And I think Jim's right on that. I don't know how quickly it'll happen, but I've said this several months ago. I said, you know, he's going to drive us into such a hole that no one's going to vote for his party for the next 20 years because of So
If
I'm still hopeful that'll happen.
if you still have the opportunity to vote, absolutely.
I think as a political scientist, I'm going to put on my political scientist hat. In the United States, it's extremely hard to systematically deprive people of the right to vote. It's also extremely hard to grant people the right to vote. As we've seen over the last 50 years of the civil rights struggle, and that was a fight because the states have most of the control when it comes to elections. And the ability of the president to or anybody in Washington to significantly change that is going to be is difficult at best, as you can see the fights we've had over the Voting Rights Amendment, for instance, or Voting Rights Act, I mean, for instance. So anyway, I'm
Tom, I
hopeful that
hope
that's not going to go that bad.
Tom, I hope you're right.
Yeah.
But it seems to me we are 50% over the edge already, and that's never happened before.
Yes,
So
but I think
I don't
yeah.
pray much, but I'm praying right now that we can step back from over the edge.